I offered today to do an art stop on the German Expressionism show, and our art stops typically talk about one or two works, usually not the first thing in a show, but I thought that this painting by Max Pechstein would work well for the talk today for three reasons. One is that it helps us talk about the bequest that is the reason for the exhibition happening right now. Secondly, it is placed here at the beginning of the show because I think it sums up better than any other single work in the exhibition what the German Expressionists were getting at, what the goals of the movement were, what the artists were trying to accomplish. And then third, I want to address the question that comes up with all too distressing regularity as to why we have hung the painting on the other side of this wall upside down. Which, despite the label text on both this and the other side of the wall, continues to be asked. Anyway, the work is called Magdalena, Still Life with Nude. It's painted by Hermann Max Pechstein in 1912. It's signed and dated up top. And this is one of the highlights of a recent bequest that we received last year. Somewhat out of the blue, we received a letter from a notary in Amsterdam telling us that we had been bequeathed the collection of modern German art owned by Mrs. Elizabeth Giesberger, and we had the right to all of the collection, any of the works in the collection, or all of the works in the collection that had been exhibited here in 1984 as part of the exhibition of Vincent Condon's collection of Expressionism. Now, when this letter came in, none of us in the curatorial department happened to have been in San Diego, much less here at the museum in 1984, so we didn't really know what this meant. But imagine our delight to discover that there were 49 works sort of evenly divided between paintings, prints, and drawings by German and Austrian modern artists, ranging from Klimt to Pechstein, Schmidt-Rottluff, Max Beckmann, George Gross, all of the big names in German Expressionism that sort of came in almost by accident, because it's not really by accident. Interestingly, back in 1984, at the time when his collection was shown here, Vance Condon, the man who formed the collection, explained that when he moved to San Diego in 1953, he went and saw the collection of Norton Walbridge, and he was blown away by these modern German paintings that Walbridge had collected. The bright colors, the bold forms, these were not like paintings that Condon had ever really thought about before, and he was inspired to begin collecting those himself. Now, it turns out that Norton Walbridge's collection was itself inspired by another collection here in San Diego, that of Earl Grant. And what happened in time was that first Earl Grant's collection, beginning in the 70s, and then the Norton collection, Norton Barbara Walbridge collection, in the 1990s, came to this museum and are now part of our permanent collection. So in a way, we have a third generation collector inspired by the other two, following their model and ultimately bequeathing his collection to us as well. And the heart of this exhibition is made up of those works. And it's fascinating to go through and do what curators do, which is to read credit lines and see which ones were in the recent bequest or which ones came in the 90s or the 70s. Because although all three of these people collected German Expressionism, they all had slightly different tastes. And so some of the things that Vance Condon collected were absent from the collection before. They weren't things that appealed to the Walbridges or to Earl Grant. Together, what they allow us to do is to present a more or less complete story of the movement, not only in paintings, but also in drawings and prints, which is significant because perhaps more than any of the other contemporary movements in the early 20th century, German Expressionism was very much about printmaking and about the graphic arts. This was partly a return to the great age of German art of Albrecht Dürer and others in the Renaissance, so much associated with woodcuts and engravings, also with drawing as well. This is also partly because the Expressionists were deliberately anti-bourgeois. They essentially wanted to stick a finger in the eye of the bourgeois. This meant they didn't sell that much work. It meant that in the early years, they literally didn't have money to buy canvases and paint. And so much of their production was carried out in drawings. And so if you don't include drawings and prints, you don't get the whole sense of the movement. Also, this poverty is something that will come up again later in my talk. In this painting, though, as I said, Pechstein summarizes much of what Expressionism was about in its early years, especially with the group known as Die Brücke, the bridge, that was formed in the first years of the century by a group of architecture students in Dresden. And this is interesting. It's an artistic movement, a painting movement, that's not formed by trained painters, but by architecture students. Yes, they're in the arts, but they're not trained in that academic tradition. They haven't gone through art school and learned to draw in the traditional way. What they're interested in doing, though, is creating a new kind of art that was deliberately anti-academic so that it would have a kind of impact, so that it would have a direct resonance with viewers, that it wouldn't just be subsumed into the long tradition of classical painting going back to the Renaissance, but would look radically new, would draw attention to itself. Many of their subjects, such as this nude, were likewise confrontational. There is no way you can look at this picture and presume that this is yet another classical nymph or Venus or anything like that. This is something much more challenging, and that's likewise the case, for example, in the drawings of nudes by Kirchner off to my left. There's no mistaking these for drawings of classical nudes. These are naked people lying around in the studio in those drawings. How they got to this new style, though, what their models were, they looked especially, although they didn't like to admit it, to French post-impressionism. Above all, to Paul Gauguin and to Henri Matisse. Now, I think Matisse's influence is immediately apparent in the bold colors of a work like this, or many of the others in this show. Remember, Matisse in 1904, 1905 still wasn't the establishment. He wasn't the great Henri Matisse that we think of him today. He was a rather radical young painter, so radical that he and his associates were branded the fauves, the wild beasts. There was something uncontrolled in their paintings. There was something wild in them. And that is very much a part of what's going on here with these bright colors, in many cases unmixed colors. The fact that this nude is painted not in gentle flesh tones, but in these kind of acidic greens. It should call to mind, as it would have for contemporary viewers, something like Matisse's great blue nude, Souvenir of Biskra, now in the Baltimore Museum of Art, or any of a score of other pictures painted in those years. The other great influence in early Expressionism, and especially on Die Brücke, is Paul Gauguin, who symbolized not only the return to a kind of primitivism, as they would have called it in painting, looking not to the classical tradition, but going and looking at African and oceanic works to find new ways of seeing and new ways of presenting the world. But also, Gauguin was admired by the Expressionists for his very escapism. Here's the guy, conventional banker, gives up his career, goes native down in the South Pacific. There was something in that escape from what was expected that appealed on a personal level as well as an artistic level to the artists who made up Die Brücke. And so along with looking at the examples of French post-impressionism, some of which were being exhibited in Dresden and Berlin by the time these works were being done, they spent much time in the ethnographic museums in Dresden and Berlin, going and looking specifically at African and especially at oceanic, at Pacific Island art. And I think you get a sense here in the mask-like face of this person, or you need only look around the room to see something like the Schmidt-Rottluff woodcut there at the center of the wall to realize how informed this art is by those great wooden masks. This, again, is precisely the moment when, famously in France, Picasso is doing the same. This is more or less contemporary with the painting of the Demoiselle d'Avignon and other such works. It's not necessarily directly inspired by Picasso's example. It's more a matter of a common desire to get out of the conventions of art and go for something that found a new power in returning to a kind of primitive mode of seeing, as it would have been called at the time. If there's any question in this painting about its series of influences and its associations with non-Western art, in addition to the nude and the bright colors, you have here just above center this object, which hasn't been identified, but is surely something that a piece of non-Western art that Pechstein had studied in the Ethnographic Museum in Dresden. Interestingly, he called this painting Magdalena Still Life with Nude, almost inverting what we expect the title to be, Nude with Still Life. I think part of that is how he wants to stress, to some extent, that all of these objects are as important as the nude. It's not the thing being painted so much as the way things are being painted that is important. Also, to that end, it's interesting that when this painting came in and we began looking closely at it, we realized that there are parts of the paint surface that don't follow the form. So, for example, to the right of the woman's face, you see this large curving form here, and then perhaps a little bit more delicate to discuss, if you look at her right breast, you see a flower pattern in the paint texture that doesn't follow any of the brush strokes on the surface. We accordingly had the painting x-rayed at the conservation studio, and in fact there was another large still life painted first on this side of the canvas, in which this jug, or one just like it, but a jug of that shape, occupied the center of the canvas and was decorated with bright flower patterns, looking even more perhaps like something out of a Matisse painting. And perhaps that's part of the formulation in calling this Still Life with Nude. But in those acidic colors, in this non-traditional nude, in this mask-like face, I think you get the idea of what the Expressionists were really aiming at, and what they were trying to convey with this bold new painting style. And this is done in 1912, but Pechstein, beginning in 1905, is right there at the start of the movement, and everything that follows in German painting for the next 20 or so years will take its start from works like this, their bold forms, bright colors, and all of that. Now, with all of that as an introduction, I want you all now to move around the back of this wall. And I said that the third part of my talk would be to answer the all too frequent question of why we've hung a painting upside down in the exhibition. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that we are getting emails sent to the museum informing us that we have hung a painting upside down in case we hadn't noticed. I think you all realize by now with the way I've put this forward that this is not hung upside down, but it is in fact just the back of the painting that we were just examining. It's put in this window and held in place, not by a traditional mounting system, because you're in fact just looking at the back of the canvas. This white rabbit here actually hides the stretcher bars of the frame. Now what happened here is that Pechstein painted this side first in 1911. We know that because it fits with an entire series of paintings done in the summer of 1911. He then reused the canvas. Now remember, I said early on, these guys didn't have a lot of money. They were often reusing, they couldn't afford paint, they couldn't afford canvas. This is one of a group of paintings by Pechstein in which he reused the canvas. And that's not simply a matter of turning a canvas over. It actually requires removing the canvas from the stretcher, turning it over, and then repainting it. When he restretched it, one side was actually cut slightly, and he has no intention that this is ever going to be seen again, so he doesn't worry about it being the same orientation right side up as the other. This is a rejected work. He's moved on, and he's gone to paint the final painting that we see on the other side, or intermediately, this still life that we see in X-ray. Nonetheless, even though a rejected painting, and even though now necessarily shown upside down, this still is a very accomplished and interesting work, very much of the same spirit as the Still Life with Nude. It's even more perhaps one of these Arcadian landscapes, figures at rest in this landscape so primitive, again to use that word that would have been one of the key words at the time, so influenced by non-Western art that it was long thought that this canvas was painted after Pechstein follows in Gauguin's footsteps and goes off to the South Pacific island of Palau in 1914. It was when exhibited here in 1984, in fact, labeled the Untitled Palau Landscape. Unfortunately, or fortunately, now we know better. We know that the work was created in 1911, long before he even went to the South Seas, but you get a sense of how strong that influence of Gauguin was. Pechstein and many of the artists of Die Brücke spent their summers on the north coast of Germany, on the Baltic Sea, many of them, including Pechstein, a small town called Nidden, N-I-D-D-E-N, which today is in, I think, Lithuania and has a different name, but was then called Nidden. And this primitive fishing village was to the German Expressionists something like Pont-Aven was to the French Post-Impressionists. It was a place that they admired because it was untouched by the modern world. It wasn't the radically new urban setting that Berlin or Dresden represented at the time. There were traditional structures, traditional farmhouses, people who weren't professional art critics there who could be relied on as models. So again, that spirit of French post-impressionism coming through, but ultimately, in either this side or the nude on the other, a painting that you would never really mistake for a work by Gauguin and Matisse, as clear as those influences are. There is something stronger, sharper, ultimately more radical in the German Expressionists. That's artistically and ultimately, I think, politically as well. And you get a sense of that even in pictures that have no apparent political vocabulary. You do get a sense, I hope, of how these pictures were meant to challenge their viewers. They were deliberately difficult pictures. That nude was confrontational. She was a kind of latter-day Manet's Olympia, another common point of reference for all of these works. She was a naked person, not some classicizing nude. And in breaking with tradition, the artists of Die Brücke give birth to the German modernist movement that you see as you go through the rest of the exhibition. Thank you. Now, one of the other questions that seems to come up with distressing regularity is, if you knew that this picture was going to be exhibited upside down, then why was it one of the works used in the publicity, on the cover of the membership magazine, in the newspaper? And therein lies a useful museum lesson about the influence that curators have over other departments of the museum. And that's all I'll say. But I was well aware months ago that the picture would be the back and upside down. Yes?
I didn't quite hear the city that you said you compared Nidden
to Pont-Aven, or those cities in Brittany, Pont-Aven or Leopold-II, those cities in Brittany to which Gauguin and others would go on as an escape from Paris. Yes?
Okay, so these artists were painting at the beginning of the 20th century, like 1900, 1912.
Yeah, Expressionism begins, let's say, 1904. Pretty much everyone's in Berlin by the time the war starts, and then the war disrupts things.
Well, what were these people seeing at that time in the world around them? Industrialism?
Oh, yeah, yes, yeah. So implied in that escape from the modern city and the desire to go to a place like Nidden is, yes, rapid industrialization and a modern world and cities that seem to some artists to be strictly concerned with modern commercial bourgeois values.
And factories where people are working 12 hours a day?
Yes, that sort of social function isn't particularly important to Pechstein, but if you go into the next room and you see Katja Kollwitz's works, they are absolutely about the plight of the worker. And Expressionism is a kind of umbrella movement. It encompasses what Die Brücke was doing. It encompasses the Blaue Reiter, which looks superficially similar, but actually has a much more spiritual underpinning. It encompasses Katja Kollwitz. What unites all of these artists is a fundamentally radical streak, a desire to challenge artistic convention, but also challenge social conventions and use art as a vehicle for that. So, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, the title Magdalene on the other side, could it be in your face to the church statement?
I don't think so. I tried to figure out who Magdalena was, and whether it's a reference to Mary Magdalene and all of that. I don't think it is. I think that Magdalena was the name, more likely the name of the model who served for this picture, but I can't pin it down either way. You just don't get in the work of these artists a real deliberately overt anti-church streak. It just doesn't seem to have been something that overly concerned them, at least in that phase of the movement.
You mentioned the word primitive many times.
Yes.
How would you relate, I can understand it with this, but how would you, could you relate it to Kollwitz?
Kollwitz isn't so much interested in what these guys would have called primitive in terms of looking to non-Western art, or a kind of, I mean, and you say primitive in quotation marks because it's a loaded term, but Kollwitz isn't interested so much in going back to a pre-Renaissance kind of art in the way that someone like this is, but you do have something similar in her work with the desire, this desire for absolute blunt reality. You look at those self-portraits, and they are the least flattering self-portraits that you can imagine. And there's something similar in that.
They're so real, they're not.
Right, right.
The realness is
right.
primitive.
Well, in all of this, it's, the search for primitive is an attempt to get back to a way of seeing that isn't filtered through hundreds of years of art's development. So it's a similar idea, although yes, the actual way it looks is rather different. You have Pechstein. Here's a Pechstein print, again, obviously influenced by African and Pacific art. But the reasons for looking at that and the reasons for Kollwitz's realism are very much the same. Yes.
I missed it. I came here late, and how come this is upside down?
Because it's in fact the back of the other painting. It's a reused canvas.
Oh,
So it's in fact the same piece of fabric as that which is painted on the other side. So the only way we could show it is if it is upside down, and although it's a rejected work, it still merits seeing. Yes.
You emphasize the poverty or the lack of funds that these artists had, but they certainly used gobs of paint.
Well, yeah, I mean, they do paint thickly. I think it's their nature to paint boldly, directly. A lot of it's unmixed colors straight out of the tube. Again, too, thinking of their models coming out of Gauguin or Van Gogh, I mean, that kind of thick, rough paint is the opposite, especially of German conventional painting, which is so smooth. There's a kind of forthrightness, and I think they would have said an honesty in that, rather than trying to paint thinly, smoothly in these kinds of oil glazes. That's alien to their nature. And they're not all poor, and they're not. So someone like Lovis Corinth is an interesting person because he's come out of a traditional academic training. He just lives a very long time, and in the last decade of his life, he really embraces what the Expressionists are about. He obviously socially is of a different place from them because otherwise he's never going to paint the aristocrat Alexander von Reitzenstein, complete with family crest. But when you look at how paint is applied, or you look at the distortions of the face, you look at the way he's trying to capture power and personality, he's embraced what Expressionism is about, even if he's not truly part of the movement.
I can't remember the name of the person you said who quit his job.
Gauguin.
Gauguin, let's go.
Yeah, Gauguin was a banker and gave it up. And
Because when you were talking about the painting and the power that just made it, it's almost, yes, you gave that banking business up, but you're still trying to show the power if you're painting in this way.
yeah, I'm not sure I follow.
Well, if you're a banker and then all of a sudden you're an artist, but in the art, if you're
Well,
in a way
I think being a banker for Gauguin represented the most, this is what he was expected to do, put on your suit, go to work, support the family, and he didn't want any part of that personally, and I think part of it is he felt that he couldn't achieve what he wanted in his art if he lived this purely conventional sort of life. And these guys certainly felt the same way. I mean, the Expressionist artists, by and large, are the true difficult bohemian artists. Kirchner's studio, was full of naked people and cats, and it was a kind of everything goes sort of place.
Did the Expressionists generally become accepted, like in the 1920s during the Weimar Republic?
Well, accepted by whom? To a point that, yes, they become the dominant artistic personality, and as you see, we have the movies playing in the back. They become associated with artistic production in Germany, and so that the film industry follows from them. However, when in the 30s the Nazi Party comes to power, they basically they confiscate Expressionist pictures. They prohibit the artists from selling. Some are prohibited even from painting.
And of course, they're used in the gender.
Of course, yes, exactly. So I think that's a reaction against their acceptance in the wild years of the Weimar Republic. But I think Germany is such a divided place that in those years that it's hard to know what accepted means.
And when was Earl Grant collecting their work?
So Earl Grant was buying mainly in the 50s, 50s to 60s, and the three collections.
It was available then.
The three collections overlap, and it's not coincidental that that you have these three big collections of Expressionism formed in San Diego, because when the Bauhaus school began to be shut down by the Nazis, Galka Schreier bought up a lot of work, or collected a group of works by the instructors, Kandinsky, Jelensky, Paul Klee, and others, and brought them to California and tried to sell them here, thinking, well, California is a place that will have a natural audience for this work, perhaps in a way that the more conservative eastern cities would not. And so beginning in the 40s, a lot of Expressionism was already being sold in Southern California. You have these big collections formed. The Pasadena Art Museum, now subsumed in the Norton Simon, has an enormous collection of Expressionism that results from Galka Schreier's sales. And some of the things that are in this show were originally brought from Germany by Galka Schreier, sold and then resold. And there was a dealer named Dazzle Hatfield in Los Angeles who dealt to Grant, Walbridge, and Condon. I'm not their sole source of these pictures, but it was an art that was heavily collected in Southern California. Likewise, you have the Rifkin collection in Los Angeles that's now at LACMA. It's just an art that found its way here early on. So, well, thank you all.